You're listening to The Breakup Theory, conversations on ending things and collective liberation. On today's episode, I got a chance to talk with Salman Brager, the artist and author of the recently published graphic memoir, Heavyweight. Salman Brager is a cartoonist and writer living in Brooklyn, New York. They're a 2023 to 2025 Jerome Hill Artists Fellow, a member of the Pinko magazine editorial collective, and the director of community engagement at Jewish Currents magazine. Heavyweight deals with Salman's own search through the archives to learn the story of their German Jewish family fleeing the Nazis and escaping the Holocaust, specifically through Salman's elective affinity for a great-grandfather, Erich, who was a boxer who punched Nazis. The book is careful to tell the story of the Holocaust within a larger context of European colonial genocide, so that we see the eventual targeting of Jews, Roma, Sinti, and others as a continuation of German policies in Africa, for example. In this light, as Saul and I discussed, we can also view the eventual statehood of Israel as a culmination of this history of colonialism and violence. Though the book's focus isn't on Israel, we do spend time in this conversation analyzing the dynamics of Zionism in relation to the stories and teaching of the Holocaust to American Jews, and the idea of Jewish exceptionalism. One of the things I loved and that we discuss also is the way Saul represents in the book their own ambivalence about this history, both in terms of family relations and scholarly practice. An ambivalence that Saul discusses as an ethical relationship to the past, an openness to being wrong. In this light, I also love the way this book depicts a kind of trans choosing of history and ancestors, as Saul finds a link to a Jewish masculinity in their great-grandfather. This is another ethical ambivalence, one that I think shows us we can tell stories of the past that don't determine our future as inevitable, while still honoring the complexities of the dead. I highly recommend this book. It's honest, vulnerable, and thoughtful. You can find Salman Brager at salmanbrager.com or on Instagram at jbbrager. I'm also linking a comic that Saul did for Jewish Currents, debunking claims to Jewish indigeneity when settlers become native. They mention it in our talk, and it's a text I've also called on in my own writing. And I also recommend checking out Pinko and Jewish Currents, of course. As always, we have an online submission form at forum.jotform.com/thebreakuptheory/stories and a phone line at 917-426-6548. Please write and call us, share your breakup stories, your questions about ending things, your hopes for liberation, whatever you want. If you like this show, please share with your friends and rate and follow us wherever you get podcasts. You can also support the project and my writing by subscribing to my Patreon, patreon.com/thebreakuptheory. If you have any extra cash, you can sign up for $5 a month, though nothing there is paywall. On the Patreon, I regularly post both short and long written pieces, along with these episodes and other conversations I'm having. I'm so grateful for all of you supporting me in this project. The Breakup Theory is a member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. You should check it out because you can find many other important and fun projects, like, for example, my buddies, The Final Straw Radio. And now, my conversation with Salman Brager.
Can you just, to start off, say your name, however you want to be referred to, and any affiliations that you would want people to know, or things you want to know people to know about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Saul Brager. I'm a cartoonist and historian, originally from Baltimore, Maryland, and I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I do a lot of stuff. I'm a member of the Pinko magazine editorial collective and the director of community engagement for Jewish Currents magazine. I'm an adjunct professor for various schools, although not right now, thank goodness.
Wonderful. Yeah, and we decided to have this conversation because you also just published Heavyweight, a book, which is really...
Sometimes I forget.
I mean, I would talk to you anyway, but the book was a reason. And I mean, I'm just going to kind of get into it. I'm not going to give a summary of the book, but we'll probably do some kind of spoiling in our conversation. But what I was really interested in the framing of the story in Heavyweight, which is like you kind of investigating your family's experience during the Holocaust, is your use of ghosts, which is something we talk about on this podcast a lot. There's like a haunting that frames the story, right? Like you actually have the great-grandfather who's the boxer that the title refers to, in one way, you know, hovering around, having conversations with your character. But it's also sort of like, I think, a haunting of history, right? And like the way that Jews relate to the Holocaust. So I just wanted to start there and think about like what your thoughts are about ghosts and how you wanted to use them, both in relationship to like dead ancestors, people, and history.
Yeah, I think ghosts have been a big part of my both like visual arts practice and also sort of my like approach to history for a long time. There is like one panel of the book where I draw myself with like ghosts coming out of my eyes and like ears and mouth and nose. And that image has been like recurring in my work for a really long time. It was like one of the first, I used to do like enamel pins and patches. And that was like one of the first pins I designed. It was like the cover of a zine I used to do called The Sinew That Shrinks. And I think I like have been pretty interested in both the way that like different forms of, just as a shorthand, I'll say inherited trauma, although, you know, I also really want to trouble that terminology or that idea, and also like forms of reckoning with what I'll also in like heavy air quotes call mental illness can appear or feel like a type of haunting or like a type of being inhabited by ghosts. And one of the like entry points that I have thought about that really heavily is through traditions of Yiddish folklore and theater. Like when I started thinking about a lot of this stuff, I was really obsessed with the both theatrical production and film of Der Debuk and just like the idea of depicts in theater and film. And then also I was really obsessed with Avery Gordon's sociological approach to haunting and this idea of like the way that ghosts kind of fill these like gaps in history and the sort of like way that that which is missing in the story or in the frame or, you know, in the archive creates this like sort of outline that we then inhabit with like the ghostly form. So yeah, ghosts have been like something on my mind for a long time. And then also like just became a sort of inevitable framing in this particular story where it almost like didn't feel like a conscious decision that I made. It was just like when I was trying to think about the character of this like real figure in my family history, that's like the way that he presented himself. So I just sort of went with it.
That's so interesting. I mean, one thought that I have like immediately is like we usually consider ghosts like a problem, right?
Yeah.
Like it's something you need to exorcise. Like I've talked to a Jewish witch friend of mine about doing kind of Jewish exorcisms with depicts and stuff like that. But in my like relationship to my history and mental illness struggles of like try to think about, you know, not struggling against the ghost, but like thinking about myself as a place that will continue to be haunted and have to be at peace with it. And in the story, the like haunting aspect is also kind of like is dramatized as like a kind of mystery about the family. And you come up against the fact that you will not be able to know all that. So like that outline you said that we fill in, you use Saidiya Hartman's idea of critical fabulation to talk about how like our like desire kind of relates to the archive and how we could possibly like fill out the holes with our own ideas or like fictional narratives. I guess like I'm wondering about where you felt like you could kind of insert constructions and where like if you had some kind of ethical relationship to it and how it kind of relates to like your desire to know.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I feel really beholden to Saidiya Hartman's work, and also my sort of like ethical relationship to it is like very much framed by my own whiteness in relationship to her work. You know, Saidiya Hartman, when she's writing about critical fabulation, is really talking about the relationship of the archive, a relationship of violence between the archive and Black women, and the way in which the archive both does violence to these histories and to these individuals and also erases them. And the archive that I was writing about, on the one hand, is like that same archive, these colonial archives of violence, and also in terms of my own family history, is an archive of people who have been victimized through the same systems in a different way, and then also are complicit in or possibly perpetrators of those violences as German citizens, a colonial empire, as white Jews, these like different positionalities that like my family has inhabited over time. And then, you know, ultimately like I am a white Jew who is a citizen of like the US imperial system. And, you know, when thinking about that, like, and I have a long history of like writing about German colonial genocide in Southwest Africa and like thinking about my relationship to the kind of like unknowable figures that I'm writing about. And I like don't feel the privilege or like capacity to like inhabit or voice like any of those figures. They're like not for me. And I think that like for me, they have to like to an extent remain unknowable, but there are like these other pieces that I can fill in. And, you know, one of the ways that I like kind of chose to do that was by filling in some of like the enactment of violence by my own family members. Where like one of the things that I wanted to write about was this relationship of like a sort of semi-lateral racism between German Jews and German Roma. And like, in order to kind of like tell that story, I like have my great grandmother, who I am like certain was racist, like name that, you know, in her dialogue. And like, that is filling in a gap that I feel very comfortable. Like, I feel like I can make her speak, right? So I think I'm on the fence about like whether or not that is like the best use of like critical fabulation as a methodology, but it's the methodology that led me to the methods that I chose in the story. And also I think it's continuously important to name like how much I'm constantly thinking about the work of Saidiya Hartman whenever I'm like doing any of the type of work that I want to do. I think that thing that maybe like most lives in the footnotes of the book is like how ambivalent I feel about a lot of the choices that I made in it, which I think that even like performing ambivalence felt important to me as like a scholar, both in denying the sense of like myself as an expert of anything, and also because I think that particularly when talking about histories of violence, like there's a lot of guesswork involved about like what constitutes an ethical approach and what constitutes like a politically effective approach in terms of like any of the aims that one might hope to accomplish with like doing a project like this. And I like want to leave open the possibility that I like went about it the wrong way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's interesting to consider kind of ambivalence as an ethical relation to the way that you either kind of project, imagine, or fill in spaces that you wouldn't be able to know. And that connects also to the place that you started, which is like Saidiya Hartman's context of critical fabulation versus like the context of the Holocaust. You know, it's different. I mean, there's like a similar kind of scene, I guess, of your relationship to the archives, which I think is like, it's really interesting because the book also, because it has a visual component as a comic, dramatizes archival research, right? And like you bring in, you like, well, you know, through your own art, you know, represent the archive itself. So we actually like seeing it. And the Germans like had a kind of obsessive like recording of the things that are happening. So it's like the gaps that Saidiya Hartman finds in the American context of racial slavery is different because like that was formed on this idea that like that the enslaved people weren't even people. While the Germans sort of, even though they're using a similar playbook, left behind a lot more. But yet there's still this kind of inability to like to know something, right? Because that record itself leaves so much.
But there's also different, I mean, there's different levels of dehumanization because for all of the demonization of Jews within the context of Nazi Germany, you know, there was like a sense of the as human actors. So like, you know, both because previous to the Nazi era, like most of these individuals are citizens of a European state. And so there's like all of these records that pre-exist that moment. And then even if the record ends, like those records were largely kept, right? Whereas like there is a completely different level of dehumanization that you see within the context of like the German colonization of Southwest Africa and of Cameroon and all of these different sites where, again, along like lines of blackness, that the like colonized peoples of these different sites are considered like a natural resource, right? And are kind of documented as such, which like aligns much more closely to the records of enslavement within a US context. And I think that like those are the records that I felt much more ambivalent about how to encounter because like in as much as, for example, there's like records of that genocide, it's almost entirely documented by like British colonists who come in and are essentially creating a record to justify them taking over the German colony.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was a super important choice in the book too, because like you're never just like hyper focused simply on the experience of Jews in the Nazi regime, but you are really careful to contextualize it in this larger history and colonialism. But the story that we get told of the Holocaust is always this kind of exceptional aspect, which gets talked about. You quote, I don't remember who it is, quoting just about the fact that it was like what was being done in, Africa and the US to indigenous people was done on European soil. And I don't know. I mean, I think that's a really interesting thing. We're like really grappling with it right now, watching Israel, which is formed sort of as hand washing of Europe's complicity in the Holocaust.
Yeah, and as a foothold of European colonial power, right? They were like, we're happy to sort of decolonize as long as we can, create another colony over here.
Right. We're like in this new stage of dealing with this kind of Jewish exceptionalism idea, like understanding of that history. So I wonder, I guess, I mean, that's also, that's something that you start the book off with too, is just like the way as a child you were kind of taught to relate to Jewish history through the weight of the Holocaust. Like this is like it's like hammered into you. And as an American Jew, at least from a young age. Can you talk just a little bit about your like personal relationship to that, the story of exceptionalism, and your coming to understand it differently, and maybe like how you might think about it now with things going on as they are?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's an exorcism in the book, that's it, right? It's like I don't have to exorcise the like ghosts of my ancestors. I have to like exorcise the like demon of Jewish exceptionalism. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a politically and religiously conservative community. I'm millennial, and so I came of age in this like time period where the like direction of Jewish institutional funding in the US context was being heavily diverted towards pro-Israel education and also Holocaust education, which was both a result of, this kind of panic over Jewish intermarriage and the idea that like Jews were going to like vanish as a people because there were too many Jews marrying non-Jews. And also the increased violence of the first Intifada, and this idea, or in the aftermath of that, this idea that like you really needed to get American Jews on board with Israeli policy in order to have continuous support of the state of Israel. And so I received like a very, very robust Zionist education and a lot of education about the Holocaust, both through a religious context, through like my synagogue and my Hebrew school, and then also through programs like Facing History, which I think could be better, but generally I have some positive feeling towards Facing History as a program. And, the result of that was that I like simultaneously felt kind of special, right? Like there was this sense that like, I had this sort of purpose that I was like a descendant of people who had survived something, and that like my job was to like be a testament to survival. And then also that I had this like very macabre obsession with the idea of genocide. And I think that like, for a few reasons, like the desired outcome of that program didn't quite work on me, partly because as huge gay, I like intermarriage wasn't like top of, that wasn't my main concern about, relationality. And then also that, for example, I like did the whole birthright thing. And for whatever reason, I like looked around me and I saw like the markers of genocide in Israel, right? Like I was like, there is a lot of violence happening here.
Yeah.
It's very strange to me that like no one else that I'm with seems to be able to see it. And I've been frequently asked, and I'm like still asking myself like why, and I'm curious to know, like, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, like why some people seem to like eat the propaganda and other people seem to be able to dispel it. And I don't think that I have like a very clean answer to that question. I could argue it's like because I was like a nerdy kid who read a lot, or because I was like a, burgeoningly gay trans child and already felt like kind of at odds with my community or my upbringing and was like looking for difference or like answers or whatever. Like I could say that it's because I was like drawn to leftist politics, which like got me out of my community of origin and like challenged my ideas. Like, you know, but there's, I think frequently like a wall that people hit that they like don't get past. And I like am constantly trying to figure out like how I got past the wall to like help other, you know, to like sort of move people in that direction. But I don't think that there's like a super straightforward answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, that question, I mean, it's like sort of the question, like, how do you radicalize someone?
Yeah.
It's like,
Totally.
but it gets specified in terms of Zionism. And like in your case, it came partially through going to the land where it's happening and seeing it. But there's so much, I mean, there's like a play of what's visible and what's invisible.
Yeah.
Right. And like,
so I don't think anyone else who was on that trip like came out with the same, you know.
Right. There's some people who report, I didn't go on Birthright, but some people report that experience as like bringing them to an anti-Zionism because they can see. But of course, it's like curated in a way that tries to keep you from that. But yeah, I wonder about it too. Like, you know, I was talking with someone at the early post October 7th about how so many people are suddenly getting it, right? And that this was like maybe the result of so much anti-Zionist organizing. And this person is like I mean, I probably said this before on the show, but like, she was like, I think it's really just Israel, like being terrible.
Yeah, really awful.
And you can't hide it. Like there's limitations of where you can hide, which is also one of the limitations the Nazis came up against was that you can't completely hide the atrocities that you commit. And so it could just be that we are seeing more of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, personally for me, like it was like a kind of no-brainer. And actually, like you were saying, a kind of an extension of my study, this study that I was instilled into me, like the relationship to the Holocaust, the interviewing of survivors, like, and that kind of archival relationship and this like Jewish sense of justice. But I also had that experience of not belonging. Mm-hmm. I had a dream once where I was like, there was a circle outside of my shul and I tried to enter the circle and God was like, you cannot go. And so at some point I was like, well, if they don't want me, then like I don't want to be part of them. And that whole interplay of like who belongs, or the kind of religious observant Jews deciding who gets to really be a Jew or not, like that just made me so sickened. And I just never understood why like the young people around me were like, Israel's our country. I'm like, I've never even been there. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. It doesn't belong to me.
I feel that really strongly. Like, you know, my parents and siblings feel like a really strong connection to Israel. Like my parents have been there once, like kind of recently, but they, you know, fly like a combo Israeli US flag, like off of their house. They like have my niece and nephew call them Saba and Safta, which I mess up all the time because I'm like, that is not what we call, or, you know, I had an Oma and a Bubby and like a Zadie and a pop-up, you know, like, so it's like very confusing to me where that comes from in particular, because I don't find there to be anything particularly like exciting or redeeming about Israeli society. And as like, I think it's like a failed experiment, right? Like, and the experiment is a colonial experiment. Like, I'm like, all right, we tried that for 75 years. It went horrifically wrong and it's time for it to end and we can move on. Like, nationalism is bad.
Yeah.
Can we all agree?
Yeah. I mean, I just like my brain went into Doikai because you wrote, was it a zine or is it just like a...
It's a zine, yeah. I did the zine for... Sorry, I don't know if you had like a particular question about it.
Because that's like the sort of one of the anti-Zionist answers to this idea of like of Israel. So maybe, if you want to talk about what your thoughts are on Doikai.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there are different models. Like I'm not particularly invested in the like old school Bundist. Like I'm not a like purist about historical leftist politics or whatever. But, you know, when I was kind of starting to really invest in my own anti-Zionist politics, a thing that was like very helpful for me was turning to these other Jewish political traditions and realizing that Zionism is not a inherent part Jewish identity or like the Jewish people, and that there are these other paths. And one of them is this concept, comes through this concept of Doikai, which literally just translates to like here-ness, and is based in a politic of like organizing in solidarity with the people around you. in the place that you are. It's a diasporic politic. It's kind of internationalist, it's about coalitional solidarity politics and being against place-based nationalism, against ethno-nationalism. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I took it as the name of this zine that I made, and there, I guess, are 5 issues, but like one out every 2 years since 2012. And I think I'm done with it now. But it was a zine that, in its original conception, was like trying to, through like people submitting their writing or art or whatever, put together a coherent-ish politic of a queer, anti-Zionist Jewish identity. And I think a big thing that happened as I was working on that zine project was that I became increasingly aware of and invested in decolonial politics, and particularly like became more familiar with the heuristic of settler colonialism. And, this kind of idea of Doike became very troubled by the fact that like we are participants in a settler colonial project in the US.
Yeah.
And, a lot of the people that are writing for this project are like in the US or Canada or Australia. The US and Canada and Australia can't be the alternative to Israel, right? It's just not as they stand. And so like ultimately the like consistently brings the answer back to this like much larger project of decolonization that has to include like the unsettling of all of these places, and not just this one that, right now is a horrific flashpoint, but is like ultimately involved in a project that looks extremely similar to all of these other sites.
Yeah, that goes back to like the kind of the complexity that we started with, is talking about like the difference of history and experience of Jews through European colonization versus like people who became Black, as they were stolen and kidnapped from Africa, or the relation of indigenous people in these different lands. And like Israel in a way solidifies this kind of racial thinking where you like reduce the Jews to a kind of minoritized people who need to be protected by a state. But that's not actually accurate to the experience of Jewishness or any kind of like quote unquote identity, which is like, I guess maybe I'll put a pin in this, but like transness, queerness is another kind of threat to those standards. And you deal with this, so you grapple with this in the book, right? Like the fact that people in your family were able to escape the Holocaust and come to the US became a sort of like privilege because they were able also in that moment to choose to assimilate into whiteness, into a middle-class existence, into settler colonial culture. And yeah, that just like complicates the way that we inherit this kind of legacy of trauma and genocide. And I think that's also something that the people who are big supporters of Israel just do not want to grapple with their own complicity, like right here in the US. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going in terms of a question. Well, I mean, I guess if you have thoughts on that sort of like the relationship of like Jewishness to this kind of identity politics, I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, sort of entry points to this. Like, obviously, there has been a lot of writing about Jewish ascendancy to whiteness. And I think, like, a thing that people are grappling with in the sort of, like, latest round of, like, nativism and ascendant fascism and white supremacist politics in the US, that comes with a hefty dose of anti-Semitism is, like, what does it mean when you are a member of a minority group that like both accesses in almost all situations this like incredible level of privilege, and then also was still targeted by, this like majoritarian violence in a pretty effective way. And, I think like Ben Warber and Shane Burley, for example, and there's a Safety Through Solidarity is their new project, are trying to get at this. And it still feels like pretty confusing to kind of like unpack how anti-Semitism works as like a particular prejudice. And, I don't think it's a form of racism. I think it's like a form of sort of like conspiracy theorist scapegoating that like honestly doesn't even particularly, I mean, like it will target Jews in as much as like people are visible as Jews. Like if people can be like, oh, there's like Jews over here, we can like slot them into this like form of anti-Semitism, but like borrowing the the like presence of visible Jews, like you can kind of fit anything or anyone into it because it's just a conspiracy theorist approach, right? If that makes any sense. But in the context of like a relationship to Israel, there's like several bizarre things going on. I think like the thing that I have been most sort of like captured by or like obsessed with is the movement to reframe Jewishness as a indigenous identity that is like a like ancient racial group that is like somehow timelessly attached to the like Levant or whatever, which is so deeply ahistorical and like frankly bizarre that it's like I thought it would be very easily countered. And I like wrote this, 15-page comic or something for Jewish parents where I like literally had the thought as I was writing it. I was like, well, this will put the nail in the coffin of this. Like, I'm like, I didn't. I like crushed this line of thinking. And in fact, that was not the case. And this is actually like an increasingly popular idea that I see often where, like people will say like Zionism is a decolonial project or like Jews are indigenous and like the Palestinians are actually colonizers and all of these like fully bizarre worldviews that I like don't, I mean, I can like explain why they're wrong, but it doesn't seem to matter.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to do with those either. And like this goes back to the question of like, how do you get a Zionist to not be a Zionist anymore? Like after October 7th, I can't even like approach those people who are like, who are spouting this nonsense. It's like just a total flip of reality. I mean, the Hasbara has always been clear bullshit, but like the bullshit that all of the states want us to swallow, and that was so explicitly wrong that I don't know how to deal with it without just like wanting to yell at someone, which obviously is not an effective way to get someone to change their mind.
It's time for a break. Back to the conversation.
But I think there's something about desire there, perhaps, which is like this desire relates to Jewish exceptionalism, but also Jewish victimization, right? That like Jews, even though they do have access to whiteness, also have a history of victimization that gives them some kind of like position of justness. And I think people want to hold on to those things, right? So that place where in which they can like claim some moral rectitude or like even deserving like some kind of special treatment.
Yeah. I mean, it's the holding on to it, I think is, and I mean, it's interesting to think about the ways in which I'm like a participant in this. In as much as I'm trying to like write against it, but I'm writing about it. Where a thing that I also think about very regularly is like how many groups of people in human history have been victimized. And it's like myriad, it's like pick a group. And to think of like, just like epoch after epoch of like horrific violence targeting one group or another for various like, stupid political reasons. And a particularity of like the case of the Holocaust is like because of the time period that it falls in, in this like moment where the colonies are starting to fall, like the European colonization of the world is falling apart, that there's like all of these like ascendant superpowers who are like kind of fighting for control over everything, like the particular like genocide of the Jews and, of course, like all these other groups who sort of like fall by the wayside, as like the narrative becomes formed, that this like particular historical violence becomes part of this like apparatus of international affairs that is like being established at that time, that like, Jews become the case study for like international human rights, for example, or like for like early cases of reparations, which are going to like, again, big air quotes, like, and so there's like a way in which we could become like canonized as the victim group in this like particular historical moment. And then anyone else who enters that apparatus of of international law or of like international human rights or whatever, like we're the case study that they get compared to.
Yeah.
And like nothing can rise to like the original case study, of course. So it's like, it's a narrative problem, right? It's not like inherent quality.
Yeah. I mean, listening to you, I was like, well, really, in the end, it's like the experience of the Jews in Europe and the creation of Israel become a convenient kind of stand-in to make it so we don't have to look at anti-Blackness, basically, as the kind of original sin of European, I mean, and indigenous genocide, but anti-Blackness as a sort of formation. Like there's, when you talk about reparations, that like we can imagine and people will agree that Jews who like either were killed in the Holocaust or fled in Europe, like deserve some kind of reparation. And there's like no political will at all to consider that for descendants of enslaved people. So in a way, like I can see that it also pushes us into that like contradictory position again, where like, I mean, I was thinking about it as like, it's like one of the hallmarks of a fascist who wants to claim both like some kind of superiority and like victimhood. And like that has become the basic play of Zionists, right? To like, and so it's just like a weird historical irony that Jews end up embodying exactly the thing that they were like, that we hold up as the most clear example of their victimization. And maybe that's another point of refusal for like Jews to face the fact that you know, in a way, Israel is like mimicking the state, the Nazi.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it was pre-written, right? Like you reference, I think in the book, I primarily talking about like the work of Amy Césaire, who is talking about Nazism as this boomerang, right? Where like European violence that is done to all of these different colonial sites in Africa and in Latin America and in Asia, then comes home to Europe through Nazism. And so Nazism is just existing European colonial structure that is then enacted against Europeans. And so, in fact, Israelis are acting as European colonialists, right? And so, like, which Nazis are. So, of course, they look like Nazis. And so the like white supremacy, the violence against indigenous people, the approach of like Lebensraum, right? Of like constantly striving for like more living space or like more of the good life, right? Regardless of how you get it, is like just like the European tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were talking before, I was thinking about like, you know, this question of reparations. And there's kind of like two threads of reparations after World War II, right? For European Jews. One was like, okay, well, before World War II, European Jews who were bourgeois citizens of different European countries who were participating in, you know, finance and colonization and, you know, resource extraction and like all of these different things, like they had shit. And then they're going to get their shit back to some extent, like if they survived or if their descendants can come and claim it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like a pretty straightforward transaction. And then the other like realm of reparation is that Germany gave a ton of resources to Israel, right? Like that was like the reparations, like Israel was the reparation. And Israel as a pre-existing project, as like, you know, Mandate Palestine was obviously a colony. And in as much as like pre-statehood, pre-Holocaust, it was a European colonial project, like through primarily German and Polish Jewish colonization of that space, right? So they were like, we'll just like throw money at this colony. That was the reparation.
Right.
So it was like always like just more colonization.
Right. And then the lie that like American Jews are made to swallow and the kind of insistence on Zionism from like the 60s on or whatever is that somehow belongs to us too, even though we don't live there, or like makes us safe. And that's the one that I think people really hold on to. And that like vector of, you know, Islamophobia really works well there because you're like, as basically the ultimate like European bastion in the Levant, it's like we're holding the line against the Arab who can be completely dehumanized, right? I mean, this is something I've been trying to think about too, is I just imagine, I kind of think of Israel as the culmination of this whole project, which is, again, it's ironic because it's the Jews who are also this like kind of ghostly boogeyman throughout European culture that get to kind of become the apotheosis of the nation state, of the religious nation state. And I'm hoping at least that in this experience we're finding and we're seeing it crumble. We've gotten a little bit away from the book, but I mean, I love this. I mean, I love this conversation. I think it's really great that you bring in like Césaire and these kind of decolonial thoughts and that you allow it to be so complex because we always we're taught to think in such siloed ways that we cannot bring these things together, and we don't want to like deal with the mess, like the messiness of Jews' complicity in colonization, in settler colonialism in the US, in like slavery too, right? There's a history of Jews owning slaves in the US that doesn't really get talked about. And also like thoughts of like how can there be solidarity of Jews with Black people, right, in the US? Like that's also kind of left a lot of the time, and the history is not really told.
Yeah, I mean, it only kind of gets brought up as like a weaponization of solidarity. Right? It's like, well, we marched with Martin Luther King, so why can't you support Israel?
Right. Yeah, exactly. To the extent that it gets like brought up. Or there's this idea that Black people are like inherently anti-Semitic or something like that, which is, I think, just a kind of holdover over like a kind of Christian anti-Semitism that's put on them. I think, okay, to like add in another layer though, because you've brought it up, like transness, right? This is something that comes up in the book, right? And that you're grappling with, because one of the things early on in the book that you say your character, right, says is like, because your family can be a little dicey, it's easier for you to turn to the dead family. And that dexiness is in relationship to a kind of failure to understand your transness, your queerness. And you say something about like the great grandfather, who's the kind of central figure, Erich, being like a trans ancestor in your head, even though obviously he wasn't trans. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of like desired relationship to history and your understanding of like transness, the role it plays in the book?
Yeah, I think like one of the ways that I started thinking about this project was like through this zine that like the Zan made like a million years, like I think like in the 90s, called Toontown, where there's this scene where Micah, who is trans, is like talking about their father, who is a Holocaust survivor, and describes like the two of them as young men sitting at a cafe before the war. And there's this moment of like trans temporality and like trans identification where you sort of like can freeze a person in time and then sort of like access that frozen moment as like source of strength or identification, or, you know, like a place to start or something that also feels, I don't know, like utopian in like a very small way, like in the sense of like utopia as like a fleeting moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, you know, when I think about all of my ancestors, I just like really strongly don't identify with most of their lives. Like I don't actually have any. I have like one great aunt who great aunt who was a lesbian, and that's like the queerest person in like my entire family history, except for this guy who was like bad at having a family, was like bad at having a job, and just like kind of like partied and was like hyper masculine and into boxing and was like a playboy and had this sort of like mythical outsized masculinity that feels like pretty like, in as much as like transness can index a sort of like inappropriate or exciting like gender performance in a way, like he's like a little bit trans in that sense, right? And it's also a little bit like, I guess this is who I've got. You know, like, so I think that like that's like the level of, I guess, like gender investment that I had in this figure. And then the other like heavy investment that I had in him was that he was a figure who responded inappropriately to the things that were happening to him. So, you know, for example, like a story that I tell in the book is that as the Nazis were coming to power, him and his brothers would go and beat up Nazis. They would like go to Nazi meetings and break them up. And that was like something that I think at the beginning felt like a pretty effective political strategy. And then like as the Nazis like actually ascended to power, it became something that, you know, was life-threatening and ultimately ended up in a weird roundabout way saving his life, because it meant that he escaped Germany in 1933 under, you know, early threat of death. But when I started working on the book, I had just gotten fired from my high school teaching job for anti-Zionist tweets.
Yeah.
And then also I had already gotten fired, but I basically had a sort of performative anger moment at work. And I think that I was thinking about what it means to sort of not be politically strategic, to just respond to something that is deeply politically offensive or, actively violent against you in a way that isn't helpful, but just kind of is coming from your body. Sometimes you just have to beat someone up.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Or attempt to, and then get the shit beat out of you. As it were. And I think that that was something I really identified with. Yeah. And, I think as you were saying, for a number of different reasons, some of which are political, some of which are about gender, which also is political. But, I don't have a strong identification with living members of my family. And I don't feel particularly drawn to find. Well, I guess that's not true. I have a tattoo of Emma Goldman. Obviously, I am drawn to find non-familial ancestors, but I still feel drawn to find familial ancestors, which obviously is evidenced by the existence of this book project.
Yeah, I love the way that you talked about that, because it also there's another part of the book that this brought up in my head where you say you want the end of the kind of nebbishy Jewish anxious stereotype that's pretty which is diasporic often, and it's one of the embodiments of it is Woody Allen. And one response to that and to the desire to overcome that is the kind of muscular Judaism that Israel embodies. But in your version of masculinity that you are choosing to inherit in this book, there's a different response to it that, yeah, I don't know. I mean, you said it really well just now, that the kind of trans relationship to gender kind of points to in a way, it points to the ridiculousness of it, the performance of it, but also inhabits it in these inappropriate ways. But I guess I don't know. Yeah, do you have thoughts more on that kind of Jewish stereotype and how we overcome it?
Yeah, I don't think I'm invested at all in overcoming nebbishness. It's more that. And then you mentioned Woody Allen, right? I think the thing that Woody Allen does really well, and I mean this in the pejorative, is using his own nebbishness and this sort of anxiety to get away with violence, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the enactment of a archetype for evil is kind of what I am opposed to, or as a form of exceptionalism. So what I particularly am very over and kind of disinterested in is this idea that particularly the Ashkenaz anxiety or IBS or whatever is some sort of intergenerational trauma, or it's my great grandparents were in a concentration camp, so my tummy hurts, and that's everyone else's problem. And some of it is just this realization that in the scarcity of late capitalism, most people have anxiety and stomach problems because we don't have what we need and don't have the resources to take care of ourselves. And so it's pretty self-centered to be only Jews get to have this level of trauma or anxiety or whatever. I just kind of want to open the door for everyone to be nebbishy and anxious, I guess. But also, yeah, I think that I guess I'm sort of trying to in terms of my relationship to masculinity or muscular Judaism, I am definitely an inheritor of muscular Judaism as a anti-diasporic approach, whether it's directly tied to Israeli nationalism or just nationalism in general. My ancestors were German nationalists. They were deeply invested in the state of Germany, and they were deeply invested in not being diasporic Jews, but rather the active citizens of the state that they were participants in, and on a military level even. It's my family served in the German military, I have family that served in the US military, and that there's a kind of nationalism in a US context also that my family has been invested in. And certainly also, in just generally in muscular embodiment of many generations of sportsmen, and women. And so there's like a way in which I don't think I've like exercised that, which, is like for me to work through.
Like that nationalism, there's also the kind of like that racial thinking that we were sort of talking about, how that plays into Israel. And I was thinking like, on the one hand, there's like truth to some of these stereotypes, right? Like I am an anxious Jew with colitis, and I've had therapists be like, of course you are like that because you're Jewish, but we can choose to tell different stories about that. Like it can be true, and yet we can tell a different story, which is also like you're transing his masculinity too, even though he was ostensibly cis. You're like making a different narrative. I think we like, perhaps it gets back to the critical fabulation thing, that we can even tell stories that are like wrong in some way. And that's one of the things about the book that I find so interesting, because one of the riskiest parts of the book is that you are really dramatizing like research. The dramatic like vector of the book, or whatever, the thrust of the book, is like you researching things. And whenever you're in the book, for the most part, you're like reading something or listening to tapes or whatever. And so like, I think that's a like really interesting kind of foregrounding, because we don't see that a lot in stories, except for like horror stories. There's always the moment they go research the ghost or whatever. But you also like, there's this haunting history is like a mystery that is ultimately unsolvable, right? We cannot have a resolution that will feel good. Going back to this earlier thing of like the ambivalence, but also like the risk of being wrong about things, I think is really actually this like real ethical commitment, right? Rather than the rightness that goes from, like we know why it's this way, we will defend it with our lives, or whatever, like the kind of nationalism you were just talking about. But as I brought up this kind of like dramatization of research, I want to hear what your thoughts are, and kind of bringing that into the story as such a prominent feature.
Yeah, I think like some of that came from this like ask that I got from early readers and from the editor of the project to like give the reader a touchstone, because I knew I wanted to include like the fruits of all of that research, right? Like I didn't want to write just like a dramatized narrative of like my family's escape. I wanted to be like, here are all these interwoven pieces of like historical research that like are going to create a pretty messy collage of history. And, there was like this ask to like have some grounding feature, and, they were basically like, you need to be in it to like guide us through why you're pulling all of these pieces together. And then also like, in as much as I was going to be in it, like that is what I do. I just like read and listen to stuff. And I think like, I guess kind of like making visible the like labor of the project. The thing that I like maybe wish I had included more but didn't is also like a thing that I don't like in a lot of memoir projects is that like a frequent like family memoir, whether it's graphic or not, conceit is like going to the site of where your family like experienced this story or this violence or whatever, and like spending time there and like discovering things, which is like in a very like touristy mode, which I don't fully understand when people get to do. Like no one resourced me to like go to Germany to like do this project. And I worked the whole time that I was working on it.
Yeah.
And I like kind of wish I had included like more scenes of me like working on a moving truck while I was like doing this research, but like adjuncting and like doing all these like different things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to like kind of make clear that there was like a mode of work happening.
Yeah. No, that's like another, I was just thinking like Jews as the people who like wrestle with God, and the like kind of framing metaphor of like boxing in this, but you get at a kind of physicality. Like we often think of like research and reading and stuff as like kind of disembodied, but like the presence of you in the frame, doing these things makes it really physical. And I really enjoyed that. Like this is not a typical memoir, even though you are dealing with personal stuff and family stuff. I also want to shout out, like, I love how the partner like comes in listening, but not jumping into like the problems in some ways, and being like pretty supportive in a really beautiful way. So I really appreciated that, because that was another nice kind of like entry into the frame. I guess like maybe just to kind of, we've been talking for a while, just as a way to kind of like wrap it up. Like, how do you feel like, because there's an ultimate like unresolvable quality, right? There's things that you'll never know. There's no way to like kind of fully get over such a history. And as we've been talking about, there's like ongoing complicity and that things, right? And so I wonder, like, as we're talking about this kind of like framework of memoir, to like how this relates to your own, like the making of this book and the putting of it out there. Like, how do you feel about it? Is there like, does that transform you in a way? Does it bring you any kind of relief or discovery?
Yeah, it's funny that you put it that way. Like, I think my grandfather sent me a message that was like, I hope that you found doing this project to be fulfilling. I was like, thank you. He was like, have you thought about writing a novel? I was like, oh, yeah, I guess I have. I don't know. I was like, I told write a book about you, sir.
Yes.
He was like, I have read many books. I was like, great. Thanks, man. But yeah, I think that, I don't have a personality of satisfaction. So in that sense, no. I do think that like I have like a couple of like pretty straightforward goals for this project. One was to like get people who were interested in reading about the Holocaust to read about histories of European colonialism. And in as much as like this book is able to do that, I think that that's like a pretty big didactic win for me. Mm-hmm. And, I don't think that it like really resolved any of my like questions about my family or like issues with my family or whatever. It is very interesting to me that like most of my relatives have now read this book. And so I am curious the kind of like long ranging impacts of that on different members of my family. I think that like depending on the political or like emotional space from which they're reading it, there will be like different impacts on different people. But, I'm not like, oh, I need to like keep pursuing it. Like, there's not going to be like a second memoir about this memoir. Like, I'm not going to do like an Alice Bechdel, like, here's the sequel that's like just about writing this other book.
It's also like a Philip Roth. I think he like would do totally recursive.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but also, like who knows what's going to happen. But I do think, like so much of my day-to-day work and project is about confronting Zionism, and particularly Jewish Zionism. And that is not a huge part of this book project. Like, it's definitely imbued within it. It's a present. And I think like, in as much as like one can understand Zionism to be a continuation of European colonialism, it's there, but it's not the focus of this project at all. And I do think that like that is the like future site of intervention for me, to like try to think about how I can usefully contribute to like that conversation, or continue to contribute to that conversation, even if I can't, draw one 15-page comic that ends the myth of Jewish betrayal.
I've cited that though before. And,
I'm glad. The reason that I make comics is like because I have like a question that I need to answer. Like they are a like method of research and interrogation for me. I'm like, I am seeing like, literally the comic starts with like the actual process that I undertook, which was like seeing a bunch of memes about Jews being indigenous and being like, this feels wrong, but I am going to like try to do a good faith investigation of why people are claiming this and whether or not it like holds any water, which is not to say that like, if I did come to the conclusion that like Jews are indigenous, then it's like go forth and like genocide the people who currently live in this place. But, it's like I am open to the idea of being wrong, right? Yeah. And for better or worse, like Jews are not an indigenous people. It just is not an operative category for the Jewish people. Yeah. So I think like I'm just gonna, keep going in that direction.
I mean, honestly, like we talked about how do you get a Zionist to like shift, and of course like the timing of this coming out, like you could have predicted something, but not the extent of terror that's happening. But I found myself summarizing it to a Jewish person who has some affinity for Israel, though isn't like full on. And I was like, yeah, this like really kind of contextualizes the Holocaust within this longer view of colonial genocide and complicity within it. And also like grapples with a kind of American survival of Judaism into whiteness. And in a way, like I can really see that as a useful step for people to understand, right? Rather than just focus on the Holocaust like narrowly framed without all of this other history, that it can get people perhaps to a place where they can see more baldly like what's happening, right? Because we have people have blinders on, obviously, that don't believe that this is like bad, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's really successful, and I found it really powerful.
Thank you.
One last thing, I love Jewishly gloomy.
Jewishly gloomy.
Which is maybe that is another sort of Jewish stereotype, but I just love that you put that in there and try to like you find it as an accurate description of yourself.
It really, like, honestly, it's like kind of upsetting, but it really is. Yeah, I mean, I actually would like to look up what the the German translation is, like what the German word for Jewishly gloomy is.
Yeah.
But, this is like a descriptor of Jewish lyrics and jazz music, which is very funny. But,
oh, really?
Yeah. But, like, when I like said the words Jewishly gloomy to my partner in like the context of this conversation we're having about Nazi jazz music, they immediately were like, Jewishly gloomy is like a very accurate descriptor of you. And I was like, that is completely true. I am like very gloomy and very Jewish. And I gloomy in a pretty Jewish way. And yeah, that is my entire personality. I'm not excited about it, but here we are.
Yeah, you can't. You have to answer the call.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think with like my partner will be like, how can you handle all the stuff that you immerse yourself in constantly, like without losing your mind? Like it's so you will like just there's all this terror. What's that?
So colitis.
Yes. Yes. Well, actually, like that. I mean, I didn't say this, but like I already like. There's the Jewish explanation of IBS, but I've also, in my like psychoanalytic understanding of my colitis, I've thought of it as a kind of internalized trans homophobia too. So to me, it's also a kind of a version of queerness in my body.
Your stomach is like eating itself.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. Thank you for making the book. Is anything that you want to say at the end? Places that you want people to direct people to beyond the book?
Free Palestine. I guess you can follow my work on Instagram at Jamie Berger, and I have a website. It's just salmaberger.com, and then continuing to work on comics about related and unrelated topics. And a lot of my comics are in Jewish Friends magazine, which I do generally recommend.
Cool. Yeah, I'll link to all that stuff too when I put this out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Breakup Theory. Rate, follow, and share us with your exes. Call or write us with your questions. Until next time.